Right now, somewhere in Inner Mongolia, the wind is blowing through an 8-lane boulevard with no cars on it. There are shopping malls here. The escalators are running. The lights are on. There's a town square with a fountain, a sports stadium that seats 50,000, and residential towers stretching 30 stories into the sky. The elevators work. The plumbing works. The streetlights click on every evening at dusk, right on schedule. No one lives here, not a single person. This place is called Kangbashi. It was built from scratch starting in the early 2000s, designed to house 1 million people. The Chinese government poured billions of dollars into its construction. Roads, schools, government buildings, museums, everything. By the time it was finished, it looked exactly like a modern city should look, except it was completely, utterly, almost perfectly empty. The outside world gave it a name, China's most famous ghost city. Now here's what I need you to sit with for a second. Kangbashi is not some abandoned ruin. It's not a place that people left. It's a place that was built, deliberately, expensively, on purpose, and then handed to the wind. The price tag? Roughly $15 billion. Try to get your head around that number. $15 billion. That's enough to rebuild New Orleans after Katrina with money left over. That's enough to put a solar panel on every school in America. Instead, China spent it building a city the size of Des Moines every street, every stoplight, every apartment, and then left it sitting there, empty, like a movie set with no film being shot. And here's the part that should really stop you cold. Kangbashi isn't the only one. China has built dozens of cities like this. Dozens. Analysts estimate there are somewhere between 65 and 80 million empty apartments sitting across the country right now. That's enough vacant housing to fit the entire populations of France and the UK combined, and still have room to spare. So the question that every economist, every journalist, every intelligence analyst has been asking for 2 decades is a simple one. Why? Is this incompetence, corruption, a planning disaster so massive it somehow kept happening, city after city, for 30 years straight? Or is something else going on entirely? The answer, and I promise you this, is not what you expect. Because China didn't stumble into ghost cities. China built them on purpose. And the reason why touches everything. Economics, geopolitics, and a strategy so coldly rational it almost looks like genius. Let's go. Let's get one thing straight before we go any further. The word you'll hear most often when Western journalists write about Chinese ghost cities is mistake, a planning mistake, a policy mistake, an overconfident mistake made by bureaucrats who didn't understand basic economics. That framing is wrong, and the data makes it embarrassingly clear why. Look at the timeline. China's ghost city construction didn't happen once, in one place, under one bad administrator. It happened systematically across decades, in province after province, under the watch of the same central government that managed to lift 800 million people out of poverty in a single generation. These are not stupid people making the same mistake 40 times in a row. Here are the numbers. Ordos in Inner Mongolia. $161 billion poured into a region built for 1.5 million, occupied by a fraction of that for years. Chenggong district in Yunnan, an entire new city built next to Kunming, sitting largely empty for nearly a decade after completion. Lanzhou new area, one of China's state-level new zones. Hundreds of square miles of infrastructure, built ahead of any meaningful population base. And those are just the famous ones. Researchers at Peking University have identified over 50 large-scale developments across China that fit the ghost city profile. 50. Now, here's the number that should genuinely make your jaw drop. Estimates from analysts at places like Goldman Sachs and Capital Economics suggest that somewhere between 65 and 80 million housing units in China are currently sitting vacant. 80 million. The math on that is staggering. If you stacked all those empty apartments end to end, you could house every single person in Germany, France, and the United Kingdom simultaneously, and you'd still have units left over. This isn't a rounding error. This isn't regional mismanagement. At this scale, this is a policy. And here's where the story gets interesting. Because if you trace back to where this really accelerated, not the slow build of the 1990s, but the explosive, almost vertical spike in ghost city construction, you land on one specific moment: 2008. The global financial crisis. Markets collapsing worldwide. Beijing watching export orders evaporate overnight. China's response was a $586 billion stimulus package, one of the largest in human history. And the majority of that money went into one thing: infrastructure and construction. Not because Beijing thought every building would fill up, but because construction was the fastest, most controllable way to keep the economy moving. The cities weren't the point, the building was. And once you understand that, everything else starts to make a different kind of sense. Here's the thing nobody tells you about Chinese ghost cities. They're not losing money. That sounds insane. Billions of dollars. Empty streets. Ghost town skylines. How is that not a catastrophic financial loss? To understand it, you need to forget everything you know about how Western economies work. Because the logic operating underneath China's ghost cities is its own system entirely. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. There are 3 layers. Let's go through them one by one. Layer 1, GDP, is the scoreboard, not profit. In China, local government officials are evaluated, promoted, rewarded, or quietly sidelined, based largely on one metric: economic growth. GDP, not housing occupancy rates, not resident satisfaction, not whether anyone actually moves in. Growth. Construction generates GDP whether the building gets used or not. Every crane, every cement truck, every steel beam gets counted. So, a local party official who builds an empty city still hits his numbers. He still gets his promotion. The incentive structure doesn't care if anyone shows up. It's like getting a performance bonus for digging a hole, and then another bonus for filling it back up. The hole is irrelevant. The activity is what's being measured. Layer 2, land, is the ATM. Chinese municipal governments have a problem. They can't run large budget deficits the way American cities can. They have limited ability to raise taxes directly, but they can sell land use rights to developers, and that revenue doesn't show up as debt on the official books. So, the playbook looks like this. Designate a new development zone, sell the land rights to a state-backed developer, collect billions in fees up front. Use that money to fund local government operations. Whether the developer ever fills those buildings is, technically, someone else's problem. It's financial engineering disguised as urban planning. Layer 3, empty apartments are Chinese savings accounts. For the average Chinese family, the stock market is a casino. Bank deposit rates have historically hovered around 2%. But real estate? Real estate always goes up. That's been the operating assumption for an entire generation. So, families buy apartments they never intend to live in. Apartments in half-empty towers in cities they've never visited. Not as homes, as assets. As the Chinese equivalent of putting money in a 401k. The result? Roughly 70% of Chinese household wealth is tied up in real estate. Compare that to around 35% in the United States. 3 layers. 3 completely rational incentives, all pointing in the same direction. Build, keep building, don't stop building. Now, here's the question that follows naturally from all of this. If the economics make internal sense, what's the strategic play on the global stage? That's where it gets dark. China doesn't just build ghost cities for itself, it exports them. And that's the piece of this story that most people completely miss, because once you see it, the entire ghost city phenomenon stops looking like an economic quirk and starts looking like a foreign policy tool. Here's how it works. A developing country needs infrastructure: roads, ports, housing, government buildings. It doesn't have the capital to build them. China shows up with an offer. We'll build everything. Full city, modern design, turnkey. You don't need to pay up front. We'll structure it as a loan. The country says yes, of course it says yes. Who wouldn't? China sends in its own construction firms, its own workers, its own materials. The money flows out of Beijing and almost entirely back to Beijing. The host country ends up with a gleaming new development and a debt it frequently cannot repay. And when it can't repay, China collects. Not in cash, in access. Look at Calamba, outside Luanda in Angola. China State Construction built an entire satellite city, 750 apartment blocks, schools, shops, roads, for roughly $3.5 billion. It sat nearly empty for years. Angola, heavily dependent on Chinese credit, found itself increasingly accommodating to Beijing's strategic interests in a region sitting on some of the largest oil reserves in Africa. Look at the Colombo port city in Sri Lanka, a massive Chinese-funded development built on reclaimed land right next to the capital. Sri Lanka took on debt it couldn't service. In 2017, it handed China a 99-year lease on Hambantota Port, a strategically critical location sitting directly on one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. 99 years. For a port. Because of a real estate deal. This is what analysts call debt trap diplomacy. Build something impressive. Attach strings that aren't visible until the bill comes due. Then collect strategic assets instead of cash. The Ghost City model is perfectly engineered for this. Construction generates political goodwill immediately. The debt comes later. The leverage comes later still. By the time a country realizes what it agreed to, the port is already built. The Chinese naval vessels already know the harbor depth, and renegotiating feels impossible. And here's the part that should concern every American paying attention. This is happening across Africa, across Central Asia, across Latin America, in America's own backyard. China isn't just building empty cities, it's building an empire. One vacant apartment block at a time. So, what happens when the whole thing finally cracks? In 2021, a company called Evergrande missed a debt payment. That sounds boring. Companies miss payments all the time. But Evergrande wasn't just any company. It was the largest real estate developer in human history, with over 1,300 projects across 280 Chinese cities, 200,000 employees, and $300 billion in outstanding debt. $300 billion. That's larger than the GDP of Portugal. When Evergrande started collapsing, Beijing did something revealing. It didn't let it fail cleanly. It didn't bail it out completely. It froze it, kept the carcass upright through a combination of state pressure, managed defaults, and very deliberate silence about how bad the numbers actually were. Because the alternative was unthinkable. If Evergrande had been allowed to fully collapse in a free market sense, it would have triggered a cascade. Suppliers unpaid, construction halted on millions of pre-sold apartments, families who had handed over their life savings for units that would never be finished, a banking sector suddenly holding worthless collateral on an almost incomprehensible scale. Sound familiar? It should. Because the last time a real estate bubble this large unwound without a controlled landing, it was called 2008. And that started not in Beijing, but in Arizona, Nevada, and Florida. Here's why this matters to you specifically, sitting wherever you're sitting right now. China's construction sector accounts for roughly 25 to 30% of its entire economy. The global commodities markets, steel, copper, cement, lumber, are priced with Chinese demand as a baseline assumption. American pension funds hold exposure to Chinese bonds and equities. Supply chains that feed U.S. manufacturing run through the same economic system propped up by this real estate machine. A hard landing in China isn't a foreign problem, it's a contagion. But here's the counter-argument, and it's a serious one. China is not the United States. Beijing can do things no Western government can: freeze transactions, redirect capital, order state banks to absorb losses quietly, suppress the kind of panic that turns a correction into a crash. They have tools. They've used them before. The question nobody can answer with confidence is, how long do those tools keep working? Because underneath all of it, the ghost cities, the debt diplomacy, the GDP theater, the empty towers blinking in the dark in Inner Mongolia, there is a single, uncomfortable truth. You cannot build your way to prosperity forever. At some point, someone has to actually show up and live in the city. And in China right now, the lights are on, but the streets are still empty.